Roll, please.
Senator Byrd, Senator Givens, Senator Meredith, Senator Schickel, Representative Burke,
Present.
Representative Elliott, Representative Proctor, Representative Witten,
Here.
Co-Chair Douglas,
Present.
Chairman Weber.
Present. We do have a quorum and are duly constituted to conduct business today. Do I have a motion to accept the minutes from the previous meeting?
Second.
Senator Schickel, Senator Douglas the second. All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, no. The minutes are adopted. We're now going to move into our presentation, but before we do that, Representative Burke, I believe, has a special guest that she would like to recognize today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is 5.5 months old and was born right after we finished session, so I'm thrilled for him to be here with me in Frankfurt.
Very good. We're happy to have him here today with us, learning early. So we're going to move on to our agenda now. We will move out of order on the agenda and move to item number 5 first. Senator Funky Fromeyer needs to go ahead and present today, and we want to accommodate her on that. So if she will come forward, and those that will be presenting for her, or with her, I'm sorry. I'm going to ask you to each introduce yourself, and then before you do that, we will swear in the non-legislators that are testifying today.
I'm Mary Catherine DeLoder with the Kentucky Birth Coalition.
And I'm Senator Shelley Funky Fromeyer from Senate District 24, Campbell, Pendleton, Bracken, northeast corner of Kenton.
Hi, I'm Victoria. Is it on? Victoria Burslem. I'm a certified nurse midwife, and I teach at Frontier Nursing University.
All right. If Mary Catherine DeLoder and Victoria Burslem will raise your right hands, we'll administer the oath. Do you swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. You may proceed with your testimony.
Thank you. I will begin today. As I said, my name is Mary Catherine DeLoder, and I represent the Kentucky Birth Coalition. We are a grassroots organization of families who desire expanded birthing options in the Commonwealth. Since 2020, we have advocated for legislation that would remove the Certificate of Need barrier for freestanding birth centers, also sometimes called alternative birth centers throughout Kentucky statutes and regulations. This year, bills were carried by Representative Jason Nemes and Senator Funky Fromeyer, and you have a handout in your packet that summarizes those companion bills. A great deal of the discussion around birth centers has focused on safety, which is the most important consideration. We know that accredited birth centers are safe based on abundance of peer-reviewed literature that affirms this. But today, I want to focus my comments on how the Certificate of Need burden impacts the existence or lack thereof of birth centers in our state. As the name implies, Certificate of Need is about need for a service, not about the safety. Licensure is how our state regulates safety. In the Certificate of Need statutes in the legislative findings and purposes, the first sentence begins with, "The General Assembly finds that the licensure of health facilities and health services is a means to ensure that the citizens of this Commonwealth will have safe, adequate, and efficient medical care." While Kentucky currently has no freestanding birth centers, we do have existing administrative regulations for the licensure requirements and for the Medicaid reimbursement of birth centers. In fact, we have licensure requirements for most healthcare facilities. Kentucky Birth Coalition holds the position that freestanding birth centers should not be subject to the Certificate of Need requirement. Birth centers are different than hospitals and do not provide the same service. Kentucky families want birth centers for their low intervention, highly personalized care in the midwifery model. It's a place where natural physiologic birth is normalized. Birth centers are small facilities where uncomplicated births take place. They generally have 4 beds or less, and there's no anesthesia or surgery. Mom and baby are typically discharged between 12 and 24 hours after birth. There's no equipment that requires a major capital expense, such as those that are governed by the Certificate of Need. There's no concern that birth centers would proliferate in an unsustainable manner if the Certificate of Need requirement was eliminated. 37 states do not require a Certificate of Need for freestanding birth centers. This includes Indiana, Ohio, Virginia, Tennessee, Missouri, and as of 2023, West Virginia and Connecticut. And you have a map in your packet showing that. The last known birth centers in Kentucky were closed in the 1980s. If you look at the Certificate of Need applications for birth centers over the last 35 years, you only get a partial picture because these numbers do not capture all the people who never apply because they believe the process is an insurmountable barrier. From 1988 to 1999, there were 4 Certificate of Need applications submitted for freestanding or alternative birth centers. 3 were from a hospital, 1 was from an obstetrician. 1 was withdrawn, 1 was denied, and 2 were approved, but they never opened the doors of those facilities. The next application was in 2012. It was denied, and it was the last one since. And I would like to focus on this denied 2012 application as a case study to highlight some of the real-life experiences of an independent healthcare provider and small business owner in this process. I'm sharing this story because of the major impact it had on future hopeful birth center applicants, and to highlight flaws in the current Certificate of Need process. The applicant was Mary Carol Akers, an accomplished, PhD-prepared APRN certified nurse midwife who dreamed of opening a birth center in Elizabethtown. As a midwife and a small business owner, Mary Carol had no prior experience with Certificate of Need, and she didn't have staff attorneys. Because birth centers are not listed in the state health plan, Mary Carol's application was submitted in September of 2012 for the non-substantive review process. With this process, there's an automatic presumption of need, and it is up to the opposing parties to prove, by clear and convincing evidence, that there is not a need for the proposed service. Her application was opposed by 3 hospitals who claimed status as affected parties, even though none of those hospitals operated an alternative birth center. An administrative hearing was held over 4 days in February and March 2013, where the testimony covered a variety of topics. Mary Carol and her team anticipated that a birth center clientele would come from a large area. The hospitals disagreed, citing that women typically don't travel that far to seek hospital obstetric services when they have closer options. Yet, a witness for the hospital said, quote, "Jefferson County residents already have an alternative to traditional hospital birth by going to Clark Memorial Hospital to utilize midwives. Currently, twice as many Jefferson County residents give birth at Clark Memorial Hospital for whatever reason as give birth in all Kentucky facilities outside of Jefferson County." End quote. He was referring to Clark Memorial Hospital in Jeffersonville, Indiana, across the Ohio River from Louisville. He used an out-of-state example to explain why Kentucky did not need more birth options. At that time, there were no hospitals in and around Louisville with midwives. It was, and still is, very common for women to travel to southern Indiana to give birth with the midwives there. Today, there's even a freestanding birth center in southern Indiana. Last year, that Indiana birth center had 110 Kentuckians travel there to give birth. Some of them came much further than Jefferson County. Mary Carol didn't have the proof at the time of her application, but we now know that her projected service area was not preposterous. Because there are no birth centers in Kentucky, Mary Carol's consultant used projections based on the increasing number of home births to estimate how many people the birth center could serve. He used this birth data because he felt that birth center clientele would be women who preferred not to birth in hospitals. The hospital's expert thought that the projected increase in home birth was unrealistic and that it had no relevance to the forecast of birth center clients. The cabinet ultimately agreed and cited this as one reason for denying the application. Well, as it turns out, the projection for the growth in home birth turned out to be fairly accurate. His numbers weren't that far off. And in fact, today we have far exceeded what he projected for that growth. While home birth and birth center birth are different, the growth demonstrates a continued demand for birth outside of hospitals. Mary Carol's team also submitted survey results from over 300 women in the proposed service area who overwhelmingly said that they would travel to a birth center. The survey data, as well as numerous letters of support from consumers, were not cited at all in the Cabinet's final decision. The fact that there was clear consumer demand for a birth center did not factor into the Cabinet's consideration of need. The application was denied in July 2013. Mary Carroll then appealed this to the Franklin Circuit Court, and in February 2015, the judge reversed the Cabinet's denial. This was more than 2 years after the initial application had been made. The court said that a hospital birth experience is not enough like a birth center experience to be considered similar, and that hospitals, as economic competitors who do not provide alternative birth services, did not have standing to challenge the application, and that the Cabinet erred by allowing the hospitals to have standing as affected parties. The court also ruled that the hospitals did not rebut by the presumption of need by clear and convincing evidence. The hospitals then appealed that to the Circuit Court decision. In September 2017, a full 5 years after the original Certificate of Need application, the Kentucky Court of Appeals ruled 2-1 to reinstate the Cabinet's original denial. The concurring judges said that since the birth center never disputed the hospital's standing as legitimate affected parties while the matter was before the Cabinet, the issue was considered waived. They said that it was inappropriate for the Circuit Court to raise the standing issue for the first time. The dissenting judge wrote, quote, "I cannot agree that substantial evidence existed in the record to overcome the presumption of need. Both sides offered evidence, but both sets of evidence were speculative at best and were based on opinion evidence as to projections rather than hard facts. Neither side presented evidence that could rise to the level of clear and convincing." The dissenting judge further wrote, "The birth center enjoyed the presumption of need. Since the hospitals failed to produce evidence of a clear and convincing nature, the presumption of need should stand unrebutted. I am persuaded that the Cabinet improperly shifted the burden of proof to the birth center, and that in doing so, it erred in denying the Certificate of Need." So after 5 years and spending over $200,000 of her own money, Mary Carroll Akers could not afford to keep going with further appeals. She closed her home birth practice and she left Kentucky. Now, clearly there are many complexities in the evidence presented, and there was a significant variance in opinions from all the judges who considered this case in the courts. While this story is of one person and one application, the chilling effect this defeat had on future birth center Certificate of Need applications cannot be emphasized enough. The common feeling is that if Mary Carroll couldn't do it, no one can. I've spoken to numerous people over the past several years who say that their dream is to open a birth center, but they cannot afford to put so much money towards an endeavor that might end in defeat. On that note, I would like to turn things over to Vicki Burslem.
Good morning. And as I said, Victoria Burslem, and I teach at Frontier Nursing University. I want to say at the outset, I don't speak for the board of directors. I'm just going to give an example of what was done. And as background, I've been a practice manager for many, many years, and I was also worked in a birth center, freestanding birth center in Delaware, and our children were all born at that freestanding birth center. The reason I'm here today, however, is the Frontier charged me with developing over a year's process of a birth center feasibility study. And we took into account economics, all the different factors that you can imagine go into development of a freestanding birth center. At the end of it, I did a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis. And obviously, it goes without saying that it's not a hypothetical that there was a litigation. It was a reality. And no large organization like a university is going to want to enter into something that potentially could cost a lot of money and not prove to be a positive outcome when we have education to do for the students. So that's all I really wanted to say is that we did a birth center feasibility study, but the fact that there was a litigation that ended negatively was a real challenge for the university to consider it going forward.
Thank you, Representative Weber, for allowing us to speak first. And I also wanted to thank Baby Irvin for being here. You're an unexpected guest, but you're kind of the subject. So thank you, fellow legislators, as well, for your attention and consideration to the impact of the Certificate of Need in childbirth options in the Commonwealth. As a new legislator, I'm asking myself, is the need determined by the intended user, the patient? At what point is the patient even involved in this certificate of need process? As so aptly shared with Mary Carol Akers, the patient was never even asked. So, a letter provided for today's meeting from the President and Chief Executive Officer of St. Elizabeth Healthcare refers to the meetings that I have coordinated to provide more understanding from the perspective of the stakeholders offering care in the birthing process. But perhaps I'm now recognizing that there were no expectant mothers or patients at any of these meetings that I hosted. An outcome requested by the CEO. The freestanding birthing center is to be located within a 30-minute drive to at least one facility with an active transfer agreement. In fact, the 2023 March of Dimes reports 45.8% of the counties in Kentucky are defined as maternity care deserts. By way of my own life experience in Senate District 24 as well, I grew up in DeMossville, Kentucky. My mom, having over 53 years of experience with St. Elizabeth, in fact, started as a labor and delivery nurse. We grew up 40 minutes away from Mom's work. And at the period of time, she had 6 more children living more than 40 minutes away. As also in Senate District 24, Pendleton County and Bracken County are considered by the March of Dimes maternity care deserts. 31.3% of women in Kentucky had no birthing hospital within 30 minutes. Effective July 17th, 2023, St. Elizabeth Hospital announced the closure of the maternity unit in Dearborn. The timing for this is in the coming months, with an exact date to be determined. All active patients will be contacted directly. You are encouraged to speak with your provider as you plan for upcoming delivery. How would you like to be the expectant mom getting that message? Will this offer the families a 30-minute proximity to care upon this shutdown? As Kentucky Birth Coalition has advocated to respond to the need by potentially more supply, certificate of need is proving to be a barrier for birth centers. The opposition has come almost exclusively from hospitals, as I have experienced in my first year as a legislator. In fact, despite my efforts to host these listening sessions and address these issues, in July, the Hospital Association, much to my surprise, has shifted their stance from expedited process of certificate of need to full formal review. Because, quote, patients' health and safety risk inherent in these facilities, end quote. Even though licensing requirements, as so aptly shared by Mary Catherine, licensing requirements, not the certificate of need, cover safety measures, as we've stated. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists have stated multiple times that they do not weigh in on certificate of need issues, but they do support the licensure and accreditation language in my bill, as well as Jason Nemes's bill from this last session. That would strengthen and update existing birthing center regulations. This task force is giving us legislators and, candidly, our Commonwealth a true understanding and an opportunity to better recognize the benefits and the challenges of the certificate of need requirement in Kentucky. We must answer, is the need being met? If in 1988, Kentucky recorded 177 home births, but in 2021, Kentucky recorded 901 home births, is the certificate of need, in fact, preventing us from freedom of health care options? My fellow Senator, Dr. Douglas, has shared with me patient compliance may be the greatest problem to Kentucky health outcomes. Freedom allows our fellow Kentuckians to make informed decisions. As a patient that is truly suffering, they are the ones that most suffer from these poor outcomes. Are we legislating expectant parents that want another option other than a hospital-based birth or a birth closer to home to leave Kentucky, to find their freedom of birthing options in another state? My daughter and many of our constituents are asking the legislature to allow their needs to be met. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony today. We do have a question from Senator Berg.
Thank you very much. And this is just something I just, you know my background. I'm actually an MD. I know that nationally, OBGYNs now pay, on average, $150,000 a year for malpractice insurance. And I'm trying to figure out, do you have people just waive their right to sue you? First of all, question, what are the educational requirements for a certified professional midwife? And two, how do you cover the malpractice issue?
So anyone, just like in any healthcare facility that would work at a birth center, would need to be licensed by the state of Kentucky. So all of the midwives are duly licensed, and all those licenses are issued by the Board of Nursing. So for a nurse midwife, those are APRNs, so they have that preparation. For certified professional midwives, they have gone through the same midwifery training, essentially, but it's just they haven't gone through the nursing school as well. So they complete their program, they sit for a national exam, and so they have essentially the same midwifery training. They just don't have a nurse background as well. So it's not a dual profession like a nurse midwife is.
And also, to more completely answer the other piece to the question, licensure is addressed by the state, not the statute. The statute that we're recognizing with certificate of need is separate from the licensure that also addresses the requirements for insurance coverage and such.
Totally understand.
Yes.
How do you protect your patients in the case of a medical malpractice situation at one of your birthing centers? That's my question.
The same way that any facility does. They carry malpractice insurance. However, those other facilities are not mandated by statutes to carry that malpractice insurance. They carry it for a myriad of other reasons. So we are simply, when we talk about malpractice insurance in this context, it would be setting a precedent to mandate it for a specific facility type. So no one is saying that birth centers or midwives are not going to carry it. We're just saying that it is inappropriate perhaps to legislate that.
I don't think you understand my question, ma'am. I'm sorry. I'm going to rephrase it if that's okay. It's the individual providers that carry this malpractice insurance, not the facilities. How do your providers assure that they have enough malpractice coverage to cover an absolute horrendous mishap in one of your facilities? And what does that cost them? That's my question.
The conversation has been around both liability coverage for the facility and the providers, and we've had extensive discussion about that. But they carry malpractice insurance would be just the same as a physician, and the same calculations as I'm not a provider, so I can't speak to how as an individual provider may determine what amount they need to carry. But to participate in private insurance or in Medicaid, there's amounts that are mandated. So many providers determine the amount of coverage that they're going to carry based on that requirement. And so that's how they make those determinations.
It's typically 1 million, 3 million.
Yeah, 1 million, 3 million is what's required in this state. So that would be the basis.
Right.
What do
And by the way, these practitioners are currently practicing in hospitals. that you're
But you
asking
want them to
questions
be
about.
able to practice in their own freestanding clinics with their own personal malpractice insurance. What does that cost in the state of Kentucky? For physicians, it's about $150,000 annually. What is the cost for a nurse midwife or a APRN who's delivering babies?
I can tell you from Georgia, where I practiced in Atlanta, it was about 50,000.
$50,000 per provider.
And I can speak with some of the providers in the state and get you specific numbers, but I do not have those right now.
Interesting. So about a third of what it costs an MD. And why is it less expensive?
Well, I think it relates to scope of practice and the fact that it's an you're practicing as an interprofessional, so that you're always having a team, right? So you have the nurse midwife, physician, colleague, team approach, so that if everything's within the scope of normal, the nurse midwife will practice it, or the midwife, the CPM. But that if there's a need, if there's any sort of risk factors, then you're going to be consulting with your physician colleague or referring the care to the physician colleague.
So each freestanding birth center has a physician on staff?
It's not necessarily on staff. It depends on the economic model. Sometimes they're owned by physicians, sometimes they're owned by business people, sometimes they're owned by hospitals, or they're owned by the midwives. But you always are going to always have a relationship with a physician colleague, whether that person is paid separately. They may not be on staff, so to speak. You just have a contract with them, or sometimes they can be on staff.
And this is by law?
It's by regulation, and again, we're focusing again two separate issues.
I understand,
CON,
but
in
if we're going to
terms
have
of
freestanding birthing centers, we want to make sure they're safe
Sure.
and people are going to be treated appropriately.
Absolutely. The bill that we're advocating for requires accreditation, and accreditation does require relationship, either again by staff or by consultancy with a physician colleague, and with the hospital as well. I think it's important to know that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services they did a huge study. Obviously, that's I'm sure you're familiar with that, and really recognized the safety as well as the financial outcomes that are beneficial for our citizens.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Yes.
And I would like to acknowledge, Senator Berg, the presentation that both yourself and Senator Meredith offered us on KET this past Monday really feeds beautifully into where freestanding birthing centers support the ability to collaborate amongst the levels of need, the levels of care, and being able to have a much smaller opportunity for lower risk, lower need, but then you will have a hospital nearer by that could be 40 minutes, as the Funky families experienced, but that in fact that's part of this need that we're recognizing isn't currently being met. Thus, the maternity care deserts, but the importance with our rural community having that opportunity to have maybe levels of care, but the importance of the professionals made available at the hospitals. We don't want to minimize. There's an absolute importance that you still have the obstetricians and the doctors and the ability to transition that care as needed. And so we are speaking about a lower level, and as Mary Catherine did a beautiful job describing, and by the way, we will be speaking about this in much more detail in the L&O committee. So we'd love to get into the details, but just trying to acknowledge where the CON is creating such a chilling effect, and we're promoting maternity care deserts, and that's what we're trying to overcome.
Senator Douglas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One question that I have is, in the OBGYN space, more recently, I shouldn't say more recently because it's been this way for probably about 15 years now, because of some of the court cases, the long-term responsibility that our OBGYN professionals are having to accept from birth outcomes. Some of the things that happen down the road that the OBGYN physicians are being held liable for, which is why, by the way, many of our newer OBGYN persons are doing the deliveries and the older ones are doing all the GYN surgery. Is it anticipated that these certified professional midwives and the nurse midwives would also be held accountable the same way?
The short answer is yes, and that's why I think to Senator Berg's question is liability insurance is important, but beyond that is the issue of safety. We know there's bad actors in every profession, and that's why licensure is so important. That's why standards are so important. And honestly, this bill that we're advocating for updates the standards because they were written many years ago, and that we want to have accredited birth centers, which addresses those very issues. We don't want any bad actors, right? We want to have standards that are appropriate for current practice for both physicians and for midwives as well. Whether your nurse midwives are in hospital, out of hospital, physicians in hospital, out of hospital, I think that's a critical foundation that all of us are speaking to.
Well, thank you very much. One of the things I will always correct, there are bad actors, and there are bad actors on both sides on both sides of that little sheet, meaning we have positions, but we also have a great deal, as Senator Frohmeyer has already mentioned, patient compliance. I just want to make sure that, again, we're not bashing our healthcare system, and we're not leaving out what is proving to be the biggest part of our healthcare system that is not only creating the increased cost, but also the increased complications.
Sure.
And that is not our trained professionals. And
Right.
and I'm sorry, and if this is going to be my dialogue, as long as I'm a senator, I will continue to say it. I think we also have to include the compliance that we're getting from
Right.
our patient population.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Givens.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the chance to ask a question, and a great presentation. I always enjoy the policy conversations we have on complex issues like this, where we're trying to balance conflicting needs. My question goes to something that you said in your excellent backstory about how we got to where we got to. You mentioned the 2012 case situation, and you indicated that in 2012 birthing centers were under non-sub review. Is that still the case today?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So the map you've got, and maybe that's where the answer lies, and I'll be brief, but the map that you included in our packet, do you have a copy of that you can glance at?
I do not. but-
Okay. Would staff be able to get her a copy? Take her that one if you want. Or can you get one? My question goes, as I study the map, we have a number of states with, and it's not in color, the copy we have, but we have a number of states with limited or no regulations. Then we have a number that have a star indicating that CON is required for the birthing centers. And there are some numbers. Georgia has 3. Apparently Georgia's CON state, but it has 3 centers. Oklahoma has 4. I see Illinois with 4. Do you know anything about New York with 7? All of those, as I understand it from the map, are CON states, but they do have birthing centers. Do you know anything about the interplay of those things?
It's not impossible in states to open a birth center with the certificate of need requirement, but overall, when you look at the numbers on the map, you find that there are lower numbers in a majority of states with the CON requirement than in states that do not have that requirement, including several of the states with the CON having a 0 on them, such as Kentucky and a few others. So it's not impossible, but in Kentucky, like I said, it has the hospitals have been the biggest opponent to trying to update this legislation. They were the, opponents for this application in 2012. And so it really kind of underscores that the certificate of need in this particular instance is really proving to be the competitor's veto in Kentucky.
Very well. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Meredith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions and a comment, please. With repeal of certificate of need, the 30-minute rule goes away?
There is no 30-minute rule. That was just, Senator Fromeyer was referencing a comment that was made in a letter that was submitted to you all. So that has been proposed by the hospitals as to be made a rule. But there is no current requirement for that if you were to open a birth center today.
Well, I certainly recognize the healthcare deserts we have throughout Kentucky and most pronounced in rural communities. But if one of these is located in a rural community that is beyond 30 minutes, even an hour from a hospital, how do you handle a major complication like uterine rupture? How would you handle that?
So as far as where birth centers are going to be located, they may or may not be located far from a hospital, but
they could be, theoretically.
They could be.
Let's talk theory here.
They may or
could
may not be located far from a hospital. If they are located further from a hospital, they would, typically with uterine, and I'm not, this might be a better question for Vicki to answer as a provider, but from my extensive conversations with many practitioners, things like uterine rupture, they often have some warning signs. And so they are closely monitoring mom and baby, just like they would in a hospital, to see if baby is showing signs of distress, if they're...
I appreciate it, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they are spontaneous.
What I will say is accredited birth centers do not recognize having VBACs, and what your association with the uterine rupture is the vaginal birth after cesarean section. They should be delivered at a hospital.
But there are instances where there's spontaneous uterine rupture. So that's what I'm asking. These extreme cases, it's not extreme when it's your healthcare problem. If that happens and you're more than an hour away from a hospital, how do you handle that within your clinic? Can you administer blood?
I think what you have to look at is what does the data show, and the
I'm asking a real life example here.
Yeah.
Can you administer blood in those clinics?
No, because we're
So the mother
referring
would bleed
everybody. The point is you have to look at what does the data show. Have there been any spontaneous uterine ruptures on a primiparous person versus a VBAC? That's where you have your risks of a uterine rupture, and the accreditation standards are they should be delivered in a hospital.
What about clot afterwards? That's another cause of maternal death.
That's right. And if there's a way to then have people transfer to the hospital if you start, because remember, the point is these are normal, healthy women that they're healthy before they're pregnant, they're healthy throughout the pregnancy, and they're healthy in the labor. That's why data is so important. And what do the statistics show? And that if people meet all those criteria, when you look at the data of what all the studies show, it's as safe being out of hospital at a freestanding birth center as it is in hospital. And I think that's
give
what...
me a couple more examples. Shoulder dysplasia.
And Senator Meredith, thank you for bringing that up as well. One of the birthing center operators was a guest of ours at the St. Elizabeth meeting in July and shared a few examples of the great collaboration with the nearby hospital and nearby obstetricians' offices as well, some of the primary care doctors, and just the value placed in having those relationships, so that if along the 9-10 months of the birthing process you recognize there's some serious issues, then they're able to recommend see Dr. So-and-so. And several examples were shared in our meetings of how that is happening outside of Kentucky, because as you know, we don't have a birthing center in Kentucky to give you specific examples. But this particular practitioner does a lot of work across the border in Tennessee and has her birthing center in Tennessee, but lives in Kentucky. So she does some home births in Kentucky, but would prefer not to. She'd prefer those to be actually in a birthing center. But she uses that example over and over of the importance of having such a good relationship. And she admits that when she started with her home birth offering, she didn't have the confidence of the community. She has the confidence of the community now. She's been doing this for many years, 8 or 10 years, and has really built a great reputation. So we know that reputation is earned. It's not legislated. It's earned. And she's done a really good job helping us recognize that's part of where we need to get to, is giving an opportunity for people to come in and earn that as well.
Well, I agree, and I'm certainly not trying to be argumentative, but you can't convince me that there's never going to be a situation where a crisis develops in a birthing center that's going to have to be addressed. It may not be within a reasonable time frame for the mother or the baby. And that's what I'm asking, is how those situations addressed.
It's also true in a community hospital. You're going to run into many times in the hospitals that aren't like you'd have at University of Louisville or University of Kentucky.
Or at Dearborn, where the maternity unit is being closed down. Yeah. I mean, it's truly an issue, and it is truly a reason that we do believe that having 771 home births, we need another option.
Well, Ms. Chair, if you allow me, just one more area I'd like to cover, in that you certainly want to address the healthcare deserts, but you're not addressing the impact on those rural communities that already offer these services. And I'm going to give you a very specific story. My small rural hospital, 26,000 county population, 100,000 service areas, we're one of the last rural hospitals in Kentucky to offer OBGYN services. I have 3. As a responsible hospital CEO, there's many times I thought, we can't afford to do this. We had subsidized it probably $500,000 to $750,000 a year to maintain that service. Yeah. Many times I thought, we can't continue this. And I had a nursing assistant that came by my office one day, and she wanted to tell me about one of her experiences. She said she walked in on a teenage mother who had delivered a preemie. Baby was sent to Louisville, as you would expect. She walks in, and the mother and finds her crying. She said, your baby's going to be fine. It's at a great hospital. She said, that's not why I'm crying. She said, well, what's the issue? She said, the issue is I don't have the gasoline money to drive to Louisville to go see my critically ill baby. The epiphany for me is, if she didn't have the money to go see her critically ill baby, she has no money to drive to get prenatal care or postpartum care. Right. I'm not sure that I can continue that service at my hospital if we don't have a critical mass of patients to deliver. Right. So if my community loses that service, we create another healthcare desert. How's that going to be addressed? Or does anybody care?
Certainly, everyone cares. We wouldn't be talking about maternity care deserts at all if we didn't care. If it's hard for the hospital to sustain that labor and delivery service, it's probably not going to be profitable for someone to come into that community and offer another birthing alternative. So as an entrepreneur, I would not choose that location to open my birth center. I'm going to, as a small business owner, look at considerations that anyone has when they open one. And while it might be beneficial to the people there are already people from that community that are driving to the birth center in southern Indiana because they want to, driving past the hospital in Litchfield, driving past the hospitals in Louisville and going across the bridge. And we've had people from some of those counties come and testify previously when this bill was being considered during session and in the previous interim. I don't think there are any examples that I'm aware of or that I have seen in any from other states where a birth center caused the closure of a rural hospital. There are certainly many factors.
I'm not saying the hospital, I'm saying the service, because it takes a critical mass to support something like that.
Well, and I'm not aware of any instances where a birth center has caused the closure of a labor and delivery unit either. So if that becomes a real concern and we can point to where that has really happened, then maybe we would have a different conversation about that, but I don't know.
It hasn't happened because we have certificate of need to protect those services presently. So,
birth centers are in relationship with the hospital. They feed into the hospital as opposed to taking monetary issues away.
I would hope that, but you can't guarantee that in every situation. You know, again, there are some bad actors.
Yeah.
It's in every profession.
Yes.
And somebody would say, I want to do these, but I only want to see private pay.
Yeah.
And I can do it much cheaper than the insurance company can do, so I want to have it there to save money. That takes part of that patient clientele away from the rural hospital and just makes it difficult to continue to provide the service.
I think it comes down to, how do we balance that with what consumers are asking for? And do we prevent them from having an option that they're asking for? The same service is essentially available in my home right now, but not everyone may want to have a home birth, and not every midwife may want to travel an hour and a half in any direction, and they might prefer to do those same services in one location. So how do you balance that with what our constituents and the people of Kentucky are asking for?
Well, I can't speak to that, only to my own district, and tell you that's problematic if we do this. But, Mr. Chair, thank you for your indulgence. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a couple more, and then we're cutting off the discussion on this. Representative Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Funky Frohmeyer, and both of you for your testimony. This is obviously very fresh to me, no pun intended, but I want to start off by saying that I am really in favor of providing more options to mothers who are going to have a baby one way or another, especially here. I have a couple questions, though, because what I realize is that with these healthcare deserts facing new mothers, expectant mothers, many of them are not going to be getting proper obstetric care before they give birth. Is that right? I mean, that's an assumption on my part, but
I think we see that currently in Kentucky as a result of maternity care deserts.
will birthing centers be able to provide obstetric care through the gestational period, or are they just providing delivery services?
So you have a difference between the care providers and the facility. So the same midwives who might be providing the birth services are going to be providing the prenatal care, but it may not be physically in the birth center. It might be in a different office. It could be a home visit. So that could happen in a lot of ways. But you're going to be required to have a course of prenatal care to be able to give birth. You couldn't just come in at the very end and say, I'm here, I'm in labor, I want to give birth. So it's going to be assured that you do have prenatal care if you're giving birth at a birth center. And one reason is that midwives typically won't just say, yes, I'll just take you on without knowing anything about you, because part of the way that they can keep the mom and baby safe is because they get to know that mom and baby over the course of taking care of them.
Okay, I appreciate that answer. Are there any plans to educate the public on that? Because I think the young mother who is not getting prenatal care is the one who's going to show up on your doorstep saying, the head's poking out, can you help? Mm-hmm. So she will have been ignoring her own well-being, the well-being of her child. What happens when you are an hour from the nearest hospital and that mom shows up?
Thank you, Representative Burke. In fact, I'm a new legislator, so some of this is new to me, but I'm not a new mom. I gave birth to my third child 13 years ago and was able to see some of the differences of how things are offered. One beautiful thing about Kentucky is we actually have Frontier University, who offers tremendous education, tremendous teaching. And in a recent conference in Florida I attended, there was a physician that said, we do not have enough midwives delivering babies in the United States of America, because the midwifery model offers so much patient compliance, so much more patient education, understanding, awareness. It also very much supports the public health, where public health is offering more teaching, more education, and that's where the midwives come in. They are teachers. They're naturally teachers, but they have captive patients that happen to be pregnant, and it will actually deliver at some point in the near future. Mm-hmm. So we in Kentucky are blessed. Here's the really sad part. Many of the teachers that are offering this educational process to their students, the students have to go outside of Kentucky to get practice hours because we have no freestanding birthing centers in Kentucky. So we've really created quite a challenge, but it's in high demand. We just don't offer it in enough hospitals, and we don't have freestanding birthing centers. So women are having babies at home. The number I said was wrong. It's 900 births at home in 2021. So the demand is there. The supply is not.
To answer yours, a very specific question, though, just like if a police officer encountered someone in labor on the side of the road, you're going to act in an emergency as a healthcare provider to take care of the person in front of you or to get them to where they need to be the safest. So if someone literally showed up who wasn't actually a client of the birth center with the baby's head crowning, they're going to take care of that person and then get them to a hospital probably immediately after that if they're not a patient of the birth center.
Thank you. Would updating our state health plan to include data and, goals for pregnant patients address the certificate of need issue in such a way that we can create birth centers without fully revoking the CON for them?
I think possibly if the state health plan said we need X number of birth centers to meet the need in Kentucky, I'm not sure how that would actually be carried out, but if it was done in that sort of a way, then clearly that would state this is the need, X number of birth centers, and we can definitively say we have not met that number of birth centers yet. So I think it's kind of a maybe depending on how it's implemented in the state health plan.
Thank you. And then one final question, which
Briefly.
yes, it is. It's a short one. Sort of following up on Senator Meredith's line of questioning, but different. So when I had Ewan, I had absolutely no symptoms of anything wrong going into the birth. It had been an extremely medical pregnancy, but fortunately my health seemed really good. The night after he was born, my blood pressure shot up to 200 over 100. I had postpartum preeclampsia. I would have already been discharged from a facility like a freestanding birth center because it was more than 12 hours after he was born. How do you protect those moms from stroke or other injury or worse if they're discharged so quickly? Even, everything seemed good.
Right. The standard is to do a home visit on day 1 and day 2, or have the patient come in on day 1 and day 2 to follow up on both the maternal status as well as the neonatal status. So that would address that need it was urgent and needed hospitalization, definitely.
Okay. That, I'll be honest, that frightens me a little bit because had I not been there,
Yes.
they wouldn't have, clocked my blood pressure and I wouldn't have been immediately hooked up to a mag drip.
Yes.
And I had to stay in the hospital 4 more days.
Yes.
So it was critical.
Yes.
We need to make sure that what we do is extremely responsible, and I want to support this, but do so in a responsible way. Thank you.
Senator Berg, can you have one brief question?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, so much. We've been talking about bad actors.
Yeah.
In this particular world, it's not so much bad actors as bad outcomes. It's bad outcomes that drives the cost of malpractice insurance for OBGYNs. And I am very concerned, and you need to tell me, ma'am, how do you avoid doing this? That if you pick and choose only the women that you know are not gonna have complications because they're young and they're healthy, they're in good shape, they have no blood pressure or blood sugar or cardiac histories, they have nothing. And then everybody who has a problem or the first sign of a problem or the first sign of an indication that you may not be able to keep this woman safe, you send her back to us so that we then have the responsibility of the bad outcomes because you're picking and choosing who we get to take care of. That doesn't seem inherently fair to the medical profession to me.
The medical profession is very concerned about maintaining scope of practice, and that's really a scope of practice issue. Taking care of those high-risk patients is not within the scope of a midwife. It's, as the doctors argue for all the time, it's within their scope. So, you can't have it both ways, that everybody takes care of everyone, or we have specific defined scopes.
But again, it's the bad outcomes. It's not, you can't pick and choose those. It's not like somebody, I mean, there are bad actors, believe me. There are people who are supposed to be in the delivery room and they're home sleeping. I mean, that has happened. But for the most part, what drives these malpractice cases nationally is bad outcomes. And it seems to me like you're just ignoring that.
It's a continuity of care. It's who's best to take care, because remember, you're working together as professions, not separately, not dumping patients. You're working for a continuity of care, that the physician is also involved, but that who's best able. We know from public health models that if you have certain people, scope of practice, that are well qualified to care for people, so that you permit physicians to care for people at a higher level of acuity with these problems that, like Representative Burke mentioned, so that it's not I think what I hear you saying is you're concerned about dumping patients, but that's not the way that it works when you have within the system, so that it's a continuity. Where can they get the best care? Which is whether it's with the midwife, with the physician, or in hospital with a nurse midwife team and a physician team.
We're going to end the conversation now. If Senator Berg, if you have some additional questions, please direct them to Senator Funky Fromeyer.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to thank you all for your presentation today. Thank you for presenting. Now, if we'd like to ask Jamie Kavanaugh, an attorney with the Institute for Justice, if you will come forward, identify yourself for the committee, then I'll administer the witness oath, and then you may begin.
Thank you. My name is Jamie Kavanaugh. I'm an attorney with the Institute for Justice.
Sure. Microphone on.
The light screen. Closer.
If your folder was covering it up, that will affect it. So.
Okay. Is that better?
Thank you.
My name is Jamie Kavanaugh. I'm an attorney and legislative counsel with the Institute for Justice.
Would you please raise your right hand? Do you swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. You may begin with your presentation.
Thank you. So thank you, Chair Weber, Chair Douglas. Thank you for inviting me here to talk about certificate of need laws. For the past decade, Institute for Justice has worked to reform certificate of need laws to ensure that people in all states have access to innovative, quality, and accessible health care. Over the last few years, I've had the pleasure of becoming a national expert in certificate of need laws. I wrote a report comparing every single certificate of need law in every state. And I recently wrote another report that you should have all received a copy of that focuses on Kentucky specifically. And I wrote that with Dr. Mitchell, who will be testifying after me. So I want to proceed with 3 parts of my presentation today. First, I want to briefly talk about the original purpose for certificate of need laws, so we can clarify how certificate of need laws affect access and other issues today. Then I want to talk about a few myths and different arguments for keeping certificate of need laws, so we can talk about some facts around that. And then finally, I'll end with a couple real-world implications for certificate of need laws, some examples that we see here in Kentucky. So in 1972, Kentucky adopted its certificate of need laws. As we all know, a lot has changed in healthcare since that time. And unfortunately, the certificate of need laws have not changed very much. At that time, the federal government started promoting these laws and encouraging states to adopt them because the federal government was worried about its healthcare spending. So the government said, what's one way we could reduce our spending? We should decrease the number of hospitals, decrease the number of hospital beds. So this was one tool that the federal government used. And the reason that this was necessary at the time was because federal reimbursements were based on what was called the cost plus model, and healthcare providers were reimbursed for their full cost of care. And we know that's not how healthcare providers and facilities are reimbursed today. But the thought was at the time when certificate of need laws were adopted that maybe facilities were growing too quickly, expanding too quickly, or opening in unsustainable areas because there was less risk. The federal government was going to reimburse everyone for their actual expenses. And since we don't have that issue anymore, it makes little sense, I guess, to continue applying certificate of need laws and decreasing healthcare facilities in the way that was originally intended. And today, agencies of the federal government, like the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Department of Health and Human Services have all disavowed certificate of need laws and explained the harms that these laws cause to patients. So I'll move to the second part now, and we'll talk about a few myths and some of the facts around arguments I hear for certificate of need laws. So I want to just dive in and address the rural hospital issue because this is something that's really important to everyone. And I hear all the time in lots of states that certificate of need laws are used to prevent rural hospital closures and to increase access to healthcare in rural areas. And so first of all, when we look at the purpose of certificate of need laws, that can't be true because the purpose is to decrease the number of facilities so they can't increase access to care. And in fact, in 2019, the General Assembly acknowledged the burden of certificate of need laws, specifically in rural communities here in Kentucky, when it enacted legislation to remove rural health clinics from the list of facilities that require a certificate of need law. So that was in an effort to encourage facilities to open in those areas because the legislature realized that these laws were holding back rural healthcare facilities from opening. And Kentucky joined a list of 8 states that have certificate of need programs and exclude certain rural facilities. Those are Alabama, Indiana, Montana, Ohio, Oregon, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Washington. Several of those states, Alabama, Oregon, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Washington, all have certificate of need laws but exclude rural hospitals from their programs. Again, because they know that certificate of need laws make it difficult for those facilities to open, and they want to encourage growth in rural communities. Certificate of need laws are also holding back the existing rural hospitals because they can't add services, they can't replace their equipment, they can't change the designation of their beds without going through this long, lengthy, expensive process. And it's often not worth it for them to apply and spend all the money and spend the years in litigation. So they're not able to meet the needs of their communities either. And we know that certificate of need laws aren't preventing rural hospital closures. Sadly, Kentucky's had 4 rural hospital closures since 2005. There's data that there's another 10 rural hospitals at risk of closure in Kentucky right now. While in contrast, there are several states that don't have certificate of need laws that have had 0 rural hospital closures since 2005. So some examples are Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. And so I want to talk about another argument for keeping certificate of need laws in place. And that's kind of the argument about cherry picking or cost shifting, as researchers call it when they're studying it. So when we break down another reason that we see rural hospitals or other safety net hospitals close or struggle, it often comes down to reimbursement rates. And we all know that, everyone talks about that. And unfortunately, that's not an issue that certificate of need laws were designed to address. Again, they were created to decrease government spending on healthcare, not to increase costs for certain payers of healthcare. But I know that many people are afraid that if we get rid of certificate of need laws, our rural facilities will close. And if that was going to happen, we would have seen it already in many of the states that have already repealed their certificate of need laws. Some of the recent examples are Florida, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Indiana, and we have no evidence of that happening in any of those states. There's also data about whether or not hospitals rely on cost shifting in some of the ways that we hear about. And that data doesn't find any credible evidence that the hospitals are reliant on cost shifting in this way. If cost shifting were critical for the hospitals to stay open, then we would expect to see facilities in poorer areas charge their privately insured patients even more. But unfortunately, there's no data that shows that that's how the costs are allocated. Likewise, we would expect to see that when government lowers reimbursement rates, that these facilities would have to increase costs on those services for the privately insured patients. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen either. So while cross-subsidization might happen, that happens in any business, cost shifting doesn't happen. And you all have some testimony as well from a member of the Vermont Certificate of Need agency who reviews Certificate of Need applications there. And he is the one who actually told me about this data, that he went out and tried to figure out how are the hospitals relying on cost shifting, and realized that all the data shows they're not. So another myth we hear is that Certificate of Need laws can decrease healthcare spending. And so that argument to me is confusing when it's coupled with this cost shifting argument. So if we accept that cost shifting is what's happening, then we're admitting, right, saying out loud that we're charging a lot of patients more for their health care. And then if that's true, Certificate of Need laws haven't accomplished their purpose that a lot of people argue for in decreasing healthcare costs. This is a huge problem in a state like Kentucky, where more than 18% of the population is saddled with medical debt. That's significantly higher than the national rate of 13%. And 12% of adults in the Commonwealth have reported not seeing a doctor because of the costs. So it's attractive, maybe, to say that privately insured patients should be on the hook for losses caused by low government reimbursement rates. But if that's what's happening, it's crippling the 60% of Kentuckians with private health insurance and the 18% of the population that's carrying medical debt today. They deserve much better as well. I've also heard the argument here in Kentucky that Kentucky doesn't have a problem with healthcare costs and prices because its costs are very competitive compared to neighboring states. And if that's true, then adjusting Certificate of Need laws would make the prices even more competitive. That would help all of these people who are suffering from medical debt right now. And it could attract patients from other states to Kentucky. Instead of sending Kentuckians to Indiana and Ohio for services, maybe Kentucky could attract patients here and get healthcare dollars from other states, which would be great for the healthcare system here. And then I want to talk briefly about federal courts and how they've addressed the Certificate of Need question. So in 2019, I represented 2 Nepali immigrants who wanted to open a home health agency in the Louisville area, specifically for the Nepali-speaking community. They were aware that the residents in their community couldn't find home health services in a language-appropriate care. So after the cabinet denied their Certificate of Need application because it found that there wasn't a need for more home health agencies, even though none of the existing agencies offered the language-appropriate care, we sued, and that lawsuit went on for a few years, and we lost, unfortunately. In 2022, the Sixth Circuit ruled against my clients Dipendra and Kishore. The courts, however, never made any findings about whether Certificate of Need laws achieved their purpose. Neither the district court nor the Sixth Circuit reviewed the cabinet's stated purposes for the Certificate of Need laws and found that the laws were actually achieving those purposes. Instead, under U.S. Supreme Court precedent, federal courts are required to uphold laws, quote, no matter how unfair, unjust, or unwise, end quote, as long as the government provides any plausible reason to justify the law. So that means the government could assert that Certificate of Need laws are necessary to decrease healthcare costs, without providing any evidence, and the court is required.
Attention. May I have your attention, please? A fire emergency has been reported in the building. Evacuate the building immediately. Use your assigned exit route for alternate safe exit. Use the stairways. Do not use elevators.
All right. We will exit in an orderly fashion. Oh my gosh.
Report to your assigned rally point for safe assembly area. May I have your attention, please? A fire emergency has been Use your assigned exit route for alternate safe exit. Use the stairways. Do not use elevators. Persons requiring assistance follow the established evacuation protocols.
Mr. Mitchell, please look at the chat box.
Rally point for safe assembly area. Attention. May I have your attention, please? A fire emergency has been reported in the building. Evacuate the building immediately. Use your assigned exit route for alternate safe exit. Use the stairway. Do not use elevators. Persons requiring assistance follow the established evacuation protocols. Once out of the building, report to your assigned rally point or safe assembly area. Wait for further instructions.